Hey, let's build something. Today I have the Swell Drive, that's what it's called, from StewMac. I got this a few years ago as a gift and obviously have not built it yet. I have no idea how informative or entertaining this is going to be, but I was planning on building the pedal anyway, and I figured, let's hang out, I'll make a video. Anyway, if you're not familiar, this pedal is based on the Boss Slow Gear, which is a discontinued Boss pedal from the 80s, I believe, and it's basically a volume swell, auto volume fade in kind of thing. I believe these kits come with everything you need to build it. You can get them in a white enclosure or a raw aluminum one. I don't know which this is, but yeah, let's get into it. So we've got some components there, pots, knobs, jacks, all the external hardware kind of stuff. Thank you for purchasing. You are welcome. Get ready to own your tone. Sick. We've got some graphics here. That's cool. I don't know. I can't tell if these are water slide graphics or stickers. Either way, cool that they include them. Oh. All right. Cool. Nice bare enclosure. Let's get this out of the way. B+. Just like my math. No, I was way worse at math. Switch goes here. This is cool. This seems very made for beginners, which is nice. There's a couple PCBs there. All your components. And your screws. Cool. All right. Well, cool. They have gone green, so the instructions are purely online. I like that. Less paper. So I have the instructions up on my laptop over here, out of frame, and I'm gonna follow along with what that says. So I like to start out by checking the parts in the kit against the bill of materials, or BOM. Not every kit for all levels of build experience will come with instructions, but you can pretty much always count on there being a bill of materials. The big pile of parts you start with can seem intimidating at first, but most parts fit into just a few categories, so it's really just a lot of the same thing over and over. I generally start with sorting resistors. If you're new to this, I've got a video on how to sort resistors here. It's pretty simple, but a little too long to explain here. Unfortunately, I didn't make it past the stage of sorting resistors before I found something missing from my kit, specifically two 470K resistors. Fortunately, I've got an assortment kit of resistors here, so we don't have to put on the brakes, but it can be so frustrating to find a missing part like this and have to contact the seller and wait for a missing part, so just grab a cheap case like this. I'll put a link for this one in the description. So let's move to sorting diodes. Diodes tend to have the type of diode printed on them. It's very small, but nice and easy, or at least it should be, but our 5v6. 5v6. Huh. So we've only started sorting through parts, and we've already found multiple things missing. This can be so frustrating, especially if it's one of your first builds. We can't have an assortment case for every type of part available, right? So one thing we need to consider is that pretty much any company that is selling kits is doing it in relatively small numbers. And the bags of parts are often put together by hand, and people make mistakes. So this is the reason that we are starting our build by sorting through our parts. So just take a breather, maybe get some fresh air, And while your head is still in it, start a list of the exact parts and quantity that are missing, because that'll leave your head really quick. Ask me how I know. And yeah, send an email. They'll generally get replacement parts to you free of charge. So frustrating, definitely, but easily fixed. Whew. So let's keep going. We should have one 33 nanofarad capacitor. Cool. All right, we're off. Unfortunately, you guessed it, parts missing here too. Missing two 22 nanofarad and two 47 nanofarad caps. The good news is that this is a much higher number of missing parts than you experience in your average kit. But whether it's one or a handful of missing parts, the process is the same. Just keep your cool, add it to the list, and then send an email. We've got our trim pot here. These are pretty neat parts. They're basically used as variable resistors. If you measure across the two outside pins, that'll be your total trim pot resistance, 10K here. But if you measure between an outside pin and the middle pin, which is the wiper, you can adjust the resistance between those two pins. It lets you dial in precise values that you can't get in off-the-shelf resistors, or dial things in by ear, which is what it's used for here. So I'm sorting the remaining parts here. Everything seems right, except that their bill of materials says the sensitivity pot should be a linear B100K pot, but what they've sent is an audio taper A100K. So we will add it to the list. So this is pretty cool. StewMac's website kind of gives a little helpful soldering tip page, which are good tips. You really need to keep the tip of your soldering iron clean. Let me get my multimeter out of the way. So I have this brass sponge here, and as we're soldering, you're going to see me do this a lot. So what that does is it keeps the tip of the soldering iron clean, and that is paramount. That is like the most important thing. Like, while you're doing this, think clean solder joints. Most of the time I see cold solder joints, they're often just like solder that is melted, but it's got like oxidation and stuff that just stopped it from making a good continuous solder joint connection. So I tend to do it like before everything I solder, and often after. And you'll also see me doing what is called tinning the tip. This is solder we're going to use. It's just regular 6337. I'm using Kester leaded solder. This stuff melts really easily. It's not, you don't breathe the lead in it. So it is safe to use, although it is a good idea to use like a filtration fan kind of thing, work in a well ventilated area, yada yada. But that's what we're using. So you keep the tip clean, and you also want to keep your tip tinned. So apply a little bit of solder, and then it kind of gives like a little, do this without burning my hand. It keeps it nice and shiny and clean. So if you don't do that, you'll see up here, I haven't done that. And it gets like this, nasty oxidation. So you're keeping the tip really clean. So you'll see that a lot. That's what I'm doing. So StewMac recommends painting your pedal before you build it. I'm not going to do that. So let's start with our 22Ks. Pretty simple. Let's bend them over. can use a little tool for this, but I kind of like to just do it by hand. And you just bend the leads over on the back and hold them in place. So we're going to take our solder, tin the tip a little bit, get it nice and clean, and then what you want to do, the important thing to remember is you're not trying to apply solder to the tip. You're trying to use the tip to heat up both the pad and the resistor lead and apply solder to the heated part, not to the tip itself. The solder is drawn to heat, so you're trying to heat the component and the pad and have it flow to that, not to the tip. So sometimes it takes a little pressure to get it to not slide around, but let's see how we do. All right, so that is one resistor soldered. So maybe you can see, there is a little bit of solder that has come through to the front side, which is good, but you don't want a lot of solder on the top. Some people have described it as like a Hershey Kiss shape is kind of the ideal, but really you're looking for that on the back of the PCB. The front, it is nice aesthetically if they all have this perfect even amount of solder that flows up on the front side, but sometimes the size of hole on the PCB itself just doesn't allow that to happen. But the back is where it's really important. If you want to be really aesthetic about it, you can apply a little bit of heat carefully to the top side. You're not really supposed to do this, but that can bring it a little more toward the front. So that's soldering a resistor. I'm gonna just keep going with all these resistors here. So I'm just inspecting the joints, making sure that I've got good looking solder joints. It's about the same amount on each of them flowing to the front, which is good. Backs look pretty similar too. And then you just trim off. You don't want to, cut the joint off. You want to come kind of like right at the leg, just beyond your solder joint. Clip it. It can be a good idea to keep a thumb or something on the end of the lead, because they can go flying and they can go right in your eye, which is as fun as it is. I'm going to recommend against it. So there we go. So let's just go ahead with all the rest of them. So this joint over here, I would describe this as too much solder. It's not going to hurt anything generally, but it's just a little too much. So if you get a little too much, you can use a handy tool called a solder sucker. So this is a spring-loaded thing, and you press the button, and it sucks up. I don't know why I'm making a big deal about that. But so what you do, get it all lined up, get your joint heated, so again, I am still learning how much is actually visible here, but you can see the hole again. So we need to add a little bit more solder, but it lets us redo it. So I'm going to do it again from the back. Check it again. There we go. Now we're good. So that's partially aesthetics. It's partially mostly good practice, I guess. It's a good idea to train yourself. You know, you're getting to solder all these resistors. It's kind of a good idea to try to be better at it by the end of it than when you started. That's kind of the way that I look at it. The reason we're starting with soldering our resistors is that physically they sit the lowest to the board, so when we flip the board over to solder it, it's not rocking and making it annoying to solder. We generally want to populate the PCB from shortest part to tallest. So I like to install resistors with the bands all in the same orientation or left to right. Makes it a lot easier if you need to double check your parts later. The first resistors I installed had a really tight footprint, so even with the legs bent really tightly, they don't sit as close to the board as what looks nice, but I'm assuming that's done in some places to make the PCB as small as possible. Alright, so there's all of our resistors. Just looking it over. No real surprises there. Yeah. So next thing would be to go on to the diodes. They're similar shape, low profile. So I'm going to take a break there. It's a good idea when you're doing this stuff. It's simple, but it can be, you know, mentally taxing. You're keeping track of numbers and where things are on the board and orientations and stuff. So it's a good idea, you know, take a few minutes, chill out for a sec, and then kind of get back to it. I'm going to send an email about these missing parts, see if there's anything that isn't actually missing but has just changed value, like maybe that missing diode, and we'll see what we get. So back in a few. So we are back. It's a new day and we've got an envelope from StewMac. So I'm just checking through what they've sent, and the part labeled on the packing list as the 5V6 diode that we were missing seems a little weird, in that it doesn't look like any diode I've ever seen. It's not labeled on the part. Granted, I'm sure I haven't seen every type, so I'm doing a quick image search online to try to find a 5V6 diode that looks like this and that might prove that this is correct. With no luck there, and since it looks like a tiny resistor, I measured it, and it happens to measure 560K. See if you notice anything about that number. That is right. I think what StewMac has packed as a 5V6 diode is just a 560K resistor, and something in their system isn't right. I wasn't totally confident about that conclusion yet, though, so nothing to do but to check the remaining parts, which do look right, email again, and in the meantime, I'll go ahead with what we do have. We are on to transistors now. StewMac has used the same lead spacing for all transistors, despite the parts not having that. These kind of unintuitive things can make a build a little trickier for beginners who are relying on footprint to dictate part positions. But for this case, you just bend the legs out a bit. You look for the transistor value on the PCB, and these are D-shaped, so you orient the shape of the transistor with the shape printed on the PCB. I like to solder the middle leg first, then check that it's standing up straight, and then solder the other two legs. Some capacitors are non-polarized, meaning it doesn't matter which way, which orientation they go in. Others will have a stripe with negative signs marking the negative lead. And for these parts, PCBs usually label the pad that the positive lead should go into with a little plus sign. So easy to make mistakes here, so take your time. Now that the caps are in, I'm putting in the IC socket. The notch on the socket aligns with the notch on the board. I'm going to wait on putting the IC in until last to protect it from any heat from soldering the rest of the components. And then lastly, the trim pot. All right, so it looks like that is all of our main components here. The exceptions being the 5V6 diode, which might be this. I'm not confident. I'm gonna double check, email StewMac, and then also the op amp, which I'm gonna save till later. So hopefully we remember these at the end. Let me know if you think I'm gonna remember or not. We'll see. So let's move on to, looks like some wiring in the guide. Got the wires cut to length specified in the guide, and then stripping some insulation off the ends to prepare them for soldering. I'm using some fancy mechanical wire strippers here, but you don't need something this ridiculous, but they are fun. Then I'm tinning each end with a little bit of solder, which encases the wire in solder for a good connection, plus it makes the wires easier to feed through the little eyelets in the board. The breakout board is nicely labeled, and great tip, StewMac recommends using the enclosure as a work holding solution to install the foot switch to the breakout board. Oddly, the wire connections aren't labeled on the main PCB, but if you follow the graphics, you can figure it out. Interesting. So, if you remember, one of the parts that they sent me, or that I was missing from the bill of materials, was this linear 100K pot. But had I looked closer, I would have seen that the 100K pot in the bill of materials is listed as a linear B100K. On the circuit board itself, it's listed as A100K, audio taper, which is what they had sent me. That is what I have here. So, do I go by the bill of materials or the circuit board? It wouldn't be a huge hassle to change out if I installed one of them to try it and needed to swap it. But seeing as I don't really know the expected behavior of this pedal, I haven't used a slow gear, I'm not sure how obvious it will be to me if it's the wrong taper. So I'm also going to wait on that part and then wait for some clarification on which one is the correct one. What stinks about this is I contacted them about some missing parts, and they clearly went off of what parts I said I was missing, which seems good, but it would have been really helpful for them to actually check what's supposed to be in this kit, because they should know better than I should. So, yeah, we'll have to wait for some clarification about that, and we'll install the other pot. So our B25K, the board says B20K, so I'm sure that's where it goes, but I'm not sure if 20K pots, linear 20K pots are common or not. I'm imagining it's fine, but there's definitely some miscommunication between the people that designed the board and the people putting together the instructions, and it leaves some figuring out to do. So you kind of have to use common sense, look for some guidance where you're really not sure, and do the best you can. Alright, this one's gotten a little longer than I expected, so I'm going to call it here. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for hanging out with me while I put this kit together. If you like what I'm doing, please consider liking and subscribing. It really does make a huge difference. Leave a comment, let me know your thoughts and suggestions for future videos, and stay tuned for part 2 coming up soon.